In March, Timothy Gagne was sentenced to 40 years in state prison after he was found guilty on 65 charges, including multiple counts of aggravated felonious sexual assault of a teenage girl over the course of several years. He was also ordered to register as a sex offender. It's a process Gagne is familiar with. The Barrington resident was previously on the list following a 1989 conviction, but he was able to petition the court to come off of it in 2016. His request granted, his name wiped from the registry.
People just don't know this is happening, but it is happening in superior courts around the state.
It's the result of a 2015 New Hampshire Supreme Court ruling in the case of John Doe versus the state of New Hampshire, which allows sex offenders convicted before the state's registry laws started becoming enacted in the 1990s to request a removal from the list. Numbers obtained by News 9 Investigates show in 2022 there were 8 petitions filed in New Hampshire courts. 2 have been filed so far this year.
And there's a basic constitutional principle that you can't be punished for a law that didn't exist at the time.
Michael Icapino is a defense attorney. He did not represent Timothy Gagne, but has represented sex offenders who wanted off the registry.
The relief that the court gave was not that you don't have to register. It was that we will give you a procedural way to get off of the requirement to register.
Gagne was one of the early petitioners.
So this was someone who had been convicted of sexually assaulting a 13 and 15-year-old, gets off the list, and within months begins sexually assaulting a 14-year-old.
Gagne underwent an evaluation. It's a requirement of the petition process. But in the wake of his recent conviction, Stratford County Attorney Thomas Velarde is raising concerns about how those evaluations are done generally.
There are some problems. There's no minimum standard for what these evaluations are supposed to look like. I've had evaluations where some diagnostic tools have been used, which I've now since learned should not be used for sex offenders at all.
These evaluations are not simply writing down what the registrant said.
They can be extensive, says Icapino.
I can't speak for every psychiatrist or every psychologist in the state of New Hampshire or elsewhere, but typically there's a battery of tests that are provided that are accepted within the scientific community. And each of these tests have their own set of scales from which the professional can determine whether or not the person is malingering, whether they're lying.
News 9 tried to sit in on one of these petitions, but we were told it was closed. And that's because although it's public information, when someone is put on the sex offender registry, it's not necessarily public information when they come off. These hearings can be confidential, and the petitioner has the option of filing anonymously.
There are some cases where folks have been targeted by virtue of their being on the registry. There are some folks who are concerned because they may have been registering for 20 years now, or their conviction may be 20, 30 years old, and they have a whole new life.
It's our list. It's the public's list. And so I'd like people to know about this a little more.
While the general public may not be aware of the removal process, victims of the petitioners are. State law requires they're notified.
And historically, that's what wasn't happening, and so that is in our statute now, which is a real step forward for victims in terms of their engagement.
Velarde says he'd like to see more laws added to the process.
But legislation in this sort of area where it's so case-specific is often really difficult to thread the needle on a piece of legislation that works justice in so many different scenarios.
So as for who keeps track of the sex offender registry, that falls on New Hampshire State Police. Officials there tell us since 2016, 32 people have been removed from the list. Meantime, Timothy Gagne is currently appealing his conviction. For News 9 Investigates, I'm Tim Callery.